Okay, today we're going to be starting our second topic in Unit 2. We're going to be talking about organic macromolecules.
That's right. That is a mouthful. Let's break that down so it's easier for us to understand what those terms actually mean. So let's start with this word organic. I've seen this word before, Ms. Hines, in the grocery store.
Yes, but in the grocery store it means like natural or doesn't have pesticides, but in science it means something very different.
Yeah, it actually has a really simple definition in science. If you see the word organic, all it means is that something contains
Carbon.
So it's just carbon containing or contains carbon. So now that we have the organic piece figured out, let's talk about macromolecules. I know molecules. That word I'm fine with.
All right.
What about macro?
So macro is the opposite of micro. So micro means really tiny. Macro is going to mean
Really big.
big.
So if I put this together, I should be able to figure out what the definition of an organic macromolecule is.
Right, it's going to be a big molecule that
Contains carbon.
So let's write that down on our papers.
So we've just taken this really scary term
Mm-hmm.
and made it pretty easy to understand. So a big molecule that contains carbon. Now, if this molecule is big, let's just think about big things in general. Big things tend to be made up of
Smaller parts.
Okay, so there's probably a word for that.
There's always a word.
All right, so let's look down at the bottom. We have this word monomer. What does that prefix mono mean?
So the prefix mono means one.
So a monomer then would be just
One piece.
excellent. Okay, and how does that relate to an organic macromolecule?
Well, an organic macromolecule is big, so it's going to be made up of many, many, many monomers.
Right, so the monomer is just one piece of the larger puzzle.
Right, you can kind of think of it as like a building block.
Exactly.
Or a puzzle piece.
Now, if we look over to the other side, we have this word polymer, which sounds similar to monomer, but monomer means one. What does that prefix poly mean?
That means many.
All right, so now I'm confused. That must mean that a polymer is big.
It is going to be big, and it's going to be made up of many pieces.
Or many monomers.
Monomers.
So a polymer is just something that's made up of lots of individual monomers, or lots of puzzle pieces.
Exactly. So if each of these squares represents a monomer, then when I put all of these pieces or building blocks together, I get a
Polymer. So a polymer is something big. So what is the relationship between a polymer and a macromolecule then? Because a macromolecule is also something big.
Those are actually just two words that mean exactly the same thing.
And which is something that's sometimes frustrating in biology class. Sometimes we just can't pick one word and decide on it, and we'll say, well, we're going to use these two words interchangeably, and they're going to mean the exact same thing.
Right.
So macromolecules then have to be made up of these smaller pieces too. So macromolecules are made up of
Monomers.
Okay, so we're going to keep those words in mind when we start to talk about individual types of macromolecules today.
So there's 4 types or classes of macromolecules that we're going to talk about in class today.
Yeah, and so we're going to quickly talk about each one so you can hear them pronounced, but there's something to remember. If they're all organic macromolecules, it means that they're all what?
They are all big.
And they all contain
Carbon.
Excellent. All right, so there are only going to be 4 that you need to know. All living things in the world, doesn't matter what type of living thing it is, has a combination of, or all of these 4 macromolecules of life. So the first one is going to be a
Carbohydrate.
The second one,
Proteins.
third,
Lipids.
and then the very last organic macromolecule that we're going to talk about is
nucleic acids.
But even though they're all different, they have something in common.
They're all
big
and they all
contain carbon. So we want to remember that.
So now we're going to go ahead and start talking about the differences between these molecules. You should see one row on your chart for each molecule. So as we talk about each one, make sure you're writing the information in the correct row.
All right, so we're going to start out with these carbohydrates.
Yum. So here's some examples of some carbohydrates. We have
bread, delicious,
and
candy corn, candy.
Can't wait for Halloween.
Then we have a potato, and then back to deliciousness, a can of soda.
Right.
So our job is to figure out why are all of these things, why are all these pictures included when we're talking about carbohydrates. So I guess we need to dive in.
Right. So these things are all considered carbohydrates because they all have the same monomer or building block.
That's right. And the building block of a carbohydrate is something called a
Monosaccharide.
And if you look closely at this word monosaccharide, the prefix of that word looks very similar to the prefix of monomer. So what does monosaccharide mean?
It means one sugar.
Very nice. So carbohydrates are a fancy way of just saying sugar.
Right.
All right, so that's hard to remember.
That's a really big word.
Yeah.
So the way that we're going to remember that the monomer of carbohydrates is monosaccharides is we're going to remember the longest words go together.
That's right. So carbohydrate, really long word, really hard way of saying sugar, is made up of individual puzzle pieces or building blocks called
monosaccharides. So make sure you write this memory clue on your paper along with monosaccharide. So next we're going to talk about the structure, what these things look like.
Yeah, so right now you see a picture of a candy house or a gingerbread house, right? Carbohydrates have something in common with that thing.
Yeah, they have this sort of, it's called a ring-like structure, but really it just looks like a candy house.
Yeah, it just looks like a house. So an individual carbohydrate, a small monomer or a monosaccharide, is just going to be this ring-like structure.
Right.
If I wanted to make a really big carbohydrate or a really big sugar, all I would have to do is what, Miss Hines?
I would have to take a whole bunch of those rings or candy houses and connect them to one another.
Yeah, and so then I no longer am talking about a monomer. I'm now talking about a
polymer or polysaccharide.
Yeah, but poly in that case still means exactly the same thing.
Right, still means many.
All right.
So the next thing we want to talk about is the function, or what these things are used for in our body.
Yeah, carbohydrates really for our class only have one job. If you think about sugars in general, what do sugars give you?
They give you energy.
So carbs have one job in the body. Their one job is to give you
energy.
They're an energy source. So let's talk about some examples of sugars or carbohydrates that give us energy. All right, so now we have our examples. We have something called glucose, glycogen, and starch. Let's start with glucose first.
So glucose is really just a very famous sugar. This is the main sugar that's in our body that provides energy.
That's right. And what happens if you run out of glucose?
If you run out of glucose, you're going to not have any energy and you'll die.
You would be dead. All right, so when people talk about blood sugar levels, really they're talking about glucose levels.
Right.
Next thing we have is something called glycogen. And glycogen has a fancier name because glycogen is a bigger sugar. So it's not a monomer like glucose. Instead, this is a polymer. And there's a reason why glycogen exists in animals, because it's only found in animals. It's not found in plants.
Okay.
What is glycogen's job?
Glycogen's job is to store energy or store glucose if you don't need it right away. So after you eat a big meal, you may not need all the energy, all the glucose from that meal. You may want to store some of that energy just for a little while.
Right, and when we store that energy, we're going to store it in this form of a sugar that's a little bit bigger called a glycogen, and it's going to be stored in our muscles, which makes sense because our muscles help us move, and they require a lot of energy. All right, last example that you need to know for carbohydrates
is starch. And starch is kind of like glycogen. It is not a monomer, it's a polymer.
So it's bigger.
Right.
It's made up of many monomers or many monosaccharides. And starch basically has the same job of glycogen, but only this time it's not found in animals, it's found in
plants.
And what's an example of something that has a lot of starch in it?
An example of something we just saw a minute ago, a good example of a starchy thing is a potato.
Exactly right. So if you were eating a potato, basically you're eating a big wad of sugar, and that's why lots of people when they're on diets tend to stay away from potatoes.
Right. So make sure you pause the video and answer your stop and jot questions for carbohydrates. Have your teacher check your answer before you keep going. All right, it's time to talk about our second class of macromolecules, which are
lipids. And remember, these guys are big and they contain carbon, just like our carbohydrates. So these examples are very different than the example that we saw on the previous screen for our carbs. So we have oils here. I see a stick of butter down there. Then I have a bowl of nuts. And then finally, I have a slice of cheesecake. Delicious. What do all of these things have in common?
They are all lipids.
All right, so what we need to do now is talk about what lipids are made of, talk about their job, and talk about some examples.
So lipids are really big molecules, and we want to be able to talk about their monomer. So the monomer of lipids is
fatty acids. So it takes a lot of fatty acids to make a larger lipid because our lipid is going to be our polymer. Now, how are we going to remember this? We gave you a memory clue for carbohydrates and monosaccharides, longest word to the longest word. So
right. For lipids, it's going to be, don't put your lipids
on my fatty acids.
So make sure you write this memory clue on your paper.
That's right. So you should never forget what the building blocks of a lipid are. Now let's talk about the structure. Why is there a comb there?
Okay, because lipids actually look a little bit like a comb. They have a structure that looks like this. They have this backbone that is kind of a square, and then they have these little teeth coming off of it, just like a comb. And those teeth represent what?
Fatty acids.
Okay, and that's helpful because if you remember, oils are an example of lipids, and you might use a comb to comb oils through your hair.
All right, so very different than carbs. Carbs look like a house. Lipids look like a
comb.
All right. Let's talk about some functions, Ms. Hines.
Okay, the functions of lipids. The first thing is energy storage. Now, that sounds a little bit like what carbs did.
Yeah, but the difference is that carbohydrates are only used for short-term energy storage. And in fact, all of those houses that you saw get really bulky and they weigh a lot. So if we want to do long-term energy storage, we're going to take those houses and convert them into lipids or combs instead. They technically weigh less, so believe it or not, fat weighs less than sugar. So that's our long-term energy storage. The second function, which is equally important, is something called insulation. What does that word mean?
So when I've heard that word is that I hear a lot of times that my house does not have very good insulation, and that's why my heating bill is so high in the winter. So I'm thinking that insulation has something to do with keeping heat in.
That's right. So insulation is just a barrier that either keeps heat in or keeps heat out. And there are organisms on the planet that actually rely on this insulation or fat in order to protect them from the cold, harsh environment that they live in. So we've talked about an example before. What example did we just discuss before with characteristics of life?
We actually discussed the example of seals.
That's right. So seals have this thick layer of blubber right underneath the skin because they live in very cold climates. And if it weren't for that insulation or thick layer of fat or lipids, they wouldn't be able to maintain a stable internal body temperature, which means that they wouldn't be able to keep what?
Homeostasis.
And if they couldn't keep homeostasis or maintain homeostasis, Ms. Hines, what would happen to that baby seal?
Like Carl Walenda, they would die.
They would die. Very sad. All right, now that we've talked about some functions, let's talk quickly about some examples. There are only 3 that you need to know.
Right, so fats, which includes things like saturated and unsaturated fats, which you may have seen on nutrition facts before.
Right. We also have oils, and we're talking about all of the oils that exist in the world. Peanut oil, vegetable oil, olive oil. The list goes on and on. The oils that you produce on your skin.
Right.
And then we also have waxes, and there are lots of different types of waxes too, like beeswax.
Right.
And then there's also wax that humans make. Where do we make our waxes?
We make wax in our ears.
That's right. So those are your 3 examples that you need to know to be successful for an upcoming assessment about lipids.
Okay, at this point you need to pause the video and answer your stop and jot questions.
All right, let's move on to our third macromolecule. Again, these are made up of carbon, proteins, and they're really big. We have 3 pictures here. I have a picture of a turkey. Looks delicious.
Yum.
We have, it's okay.
Press the button.
So we have a picture of our
turkey.
Okay, we also have a picture of some beans down there at the bottom. And then our other picture just has a smorgasbord of all kinds of stuff. We have some milk, we have some fish, we have some cheese, a cut of steak, a lobster, and it looks like some raw chicken over there in the back. What do all of these things have in common?
They all are proteins.
That's right, so they're all organic macromolecules. specifically proteins, which means that we need to figure out some other things about them. What are they made up of? What do they look like? And what are some other additional examples?
Okay, so let's dive in. So what they're made of, their monomer is going to be something called an amino acid. So go ahead and write that in your monomer box.
So reminder, a monomer is something small, so it takes a lot of those amino acids to make our larger polymer, which in this case happens to be our protein. So there's got to be a way to remember that.
So our memory clue for proteins, which you should also write on your paper, is going to be pro-amino. So write that down.
Yeah, so if you ever forget or you get confused, remember carbohydrates, monosaccharide, longest word to the longest word.
Lipids, don't put your lipids on my fatty acids.
And then proteins, what is it?
Pro-amino.
Easy way to keep them separated in your mind so you don't mix them up on a quiz or on a test. So now let's talk about what these guys actually look like.
So a lot of times when proteins are drawn, they look a little bit like sausage links.
That's right. And it would take a lot of these sausage links to make a larger protein.
Right. Each sausage is the monomer or the amino acid.
That's right. Sometimes, though, they don't actually look like sausage links. I think that we exaggerated it to make it a little easier for people. But really, when you see them on a test or a quiz, usually they're drawn like a snap bead necklace or a bead of, or a necklace of pearls, right?
Yeah, and a lot of the times on each bead there'll be these weird 3-letter abbreviations. Those are just abbreviations for the different amino acids. Since they have really long names, we don't like to write them all out.
That's right. But really, you don't need to know what any of those things are, not yet anyway. And if you see that on a test or a quiz, it's just there to what, Ms. Hines?
It's just trying to trick you.
It's just trying to mess with you. Don't let it mess with you. You should just say to yourself, that looks like a pearl necklace, or it looks like sausage links. So I know that that's got to be a protein, and each one of those little things has to be an
amino acid.
That's right. All right, so let's talk about some functions of proteins, and really there are a ton of functions of proteins.
Proteins do pretty much everything there is.
That's right. So let's talk about the first function, which is proteins provide structure. What does that mean?
So what that means is that when I look at you, Miss Cook, what I am seeing is proteins.
That's right. I'm a big pile of proteins. But you know what? So is she, and so are you. All living things, when you look at them, basically you're just looking at proteins. Our eyes, our lips, the shape of our nose, our ear, our hairs, it goes on and on and on and on. Our skin. All of these things are made up of proteins, which means that if we wanted to take it to the next level and really show how much we understand about science, really all of these things are made up of what?
Amino acids.
That's right. So that's the first function of proteins, which is pretty important. The next function, though, I think might be a little more important. It's hard to say.
I know.
So the next one is that they can speed up
chemical reactions in your body.
That's really important. Remember, all living things have to do a series of chemical reactions in order to stay alive. And that goes back to a characteristic of life.
Metabolism.
That's right. So metabolism has to happen at a specific rate. So if it doesn't happen fast enough, what happens to us?
You'll die.
Yeah, you'll get sick and then you'll die. So proteins are really important because they help to do what with those reactions?
They help to speed them up so that they can keep up with you.
That's right. So let's talk about some actual examples then.
Okay.
I think we actually have one for structure and one for speeding up chemical reactions.
Right. So for structure, our example is a protein called keratin. And this is a really important protein. It's found in your hair, it's found in your nails, it's found in your skin.
Yeah, and in fact, if you wanted to do a really simple science experiment, what you can do is go home, go into your bathroom, into either your tub or into your shower, and you'll notice that when you rub the tub or the shower, if it hasn't been cleaned in a while, there's this kind of slick, slimy stuff that's stuck that has to be scrubbed off. What is that stuff, Ms. Hines?
That stuff is old skin cells. Basically, it's a whole bunch of keratin that is stuck to your tub.
So if you want to go and feel some keratin and play with some keratin, you can clean your tub or shower.
Right. Make your parents happy.
That's right. Last thing that we're going to talk about for examples is something called an enzyme. And there are lots of different types, and for right now we're just going to talk about them as one grouping. But chemical reactions rely on these guys in order to go fast. So enzymes have one job.
To speed up chemical reactions in your body.
That's right. So if you ran out of enzymes,
then your chemical reactions would shut down. They would be happening really slow, and
you would be dead. You would be very dead.
It would be bad.
All right, we've gotten to another stop and jot. Please go back and look at your notes, answer the question that you see on the screen, and when you're done, make sure that you call your teacher over. Okay.
All right, we've come to our last class of macromolecules. It's time to talk about
Nucleic acids. I'm going to have to be honest, Ms. Hines. Nucleic acids are my favorite.
Really? I like proteins.
All right, so here's a classic example of a nucleic acid. I've seen this structure before. There are very few things in life that look like this.
This is
DNA. Where does the NA
come
from?
Look at this.
So easy.
N-A.
Very nice. And DNA is pretty distinctive because it has this twisted ladder or spiral staircase or double helix structure. And we're going to come back and talk about DNA in some greater detail a little later on because you probably already figured it out. That's one of our examples. All right, let's start with the basics, Miss Hines.
All right, so nucleic acids, they're big macromolecules. They got to be made out of smaller stuff. Those monomers are called
nucleotides.
So you need to write that word down on your paper.
Now, is there an easy way to remember that?
Of course.
All right, so what is going to be our memory clue?
So our memory clue for nucleic acids and nucleotides is going to be N with N.
Very nice. So now nobody should get these confused. Carbohydrates to monosaccharide.
Longest word to longest word.
Lipid to fatty acid.
Don't put your lipids on my fatty acids.
That one's fun. Proteins to amino acids.
Pro-amino.
And then we have nucleic acids go to nucleotides. How do you know?
N with N.
Really simple. All right, now that we know what the building blocks are, let's go on and talk about the structure.
Okay, so the structure of a nucleotide looks kind of like a step or stair.
Yeah, and that should make sense to you because when we talk about DNA, DNA has this double helical structure, right? Which basically means that it's a ladder or a staircase that's been twisted.
Right.
Well, what do ladders and stairs have in common?
They're both made up of individual steps.
Okay, so let's talk about what those steps are actually made up of.
Okay, so what a nucleotide actually looks like is kind of like this.
Has that circle and then
attached to a house looking
oh,
thing.
that looks like a house. What must that be?
Square. It looks like a candy house. It's got to be a
sugar. All right, so now that we know what it structurally looks like, or the monomers structurally look like, let's talk about what the job is.
Okay, so the job of nucleic acids is actually one of the characteristics of life.
That's right. So nucleic acids, their only job really is to be in charge of heredity.
Right.
That's really important and explains why we don't look exactly the same. Because although we have some of our DNA in common, some of our traits or our genes we have in common because we're the same species, but we don't have the same parents. Correct, Ms. Hines?
Correct.
Okay, so we received a different set of genes, and those differences account for the reason why Miss Hines has light hair, I have dark hair, Miss Hines is really smart, so that explains all of those things.
It's true.
All right, let's talk about our examples.
So there's two examples you need to know for nucleic acids. They're the only two out there.
The only two.
So you have to know them. The first is DNA. Let's go ahead and write the full name of DNA out.
This is a long one. It's deoxyribo, but then it gets easy. Nucleic acid, which makes sense because it's a type of nucleic acid that we talked about before. Now, where does that deoxyribo come from?
That's actually the name of the sugar. Remember that
so that's
candy
the
house. Yeah,
All
that's
right.
it.
RNA stands for
ribonucleic acid. So a little easier. Just take off the deoxy part.
Right, so ribonucleic acid, and that ribo stands for the what?
Sugar.
Stands for the sugar. So again, that's that house structure that's in our nucleotide.
And here I recognize DNA, and over here, this guy that looks kind of like half a DNA, that's
RNA. But another way to think about RNA is to simply say that RNA is DNA's
skinny cousin.
Pretty much. Skinny cousin. All right, now we have all the information that we need to be successful, but we do have one more stop and jot, and this one is a tricky trickster.
So we're going to help you get started on it.
Yeah, we're going to do number 1 with you so that you can know how to do number 2.
Okay, so this stop and jot is an example of an analogy or comparison.
And this is timely because you guys have just taken the PSAT and probably saw this.
Yeah.
All right, so analogy or comparison. So let's go ahead and read number 1.
Okay, so number 1 says amino acid is to protein as blank is to nucleic acid.
All right, so let's figure out how to tackle this. I'm going to break this up and figure out what the relationship is between amino acid and protein.
Okay.
So I'm going to write it out.
All right. So amino acids are what?
Amino acids are the monomers or the building blocks of proteins.
Okay.
All right, so now that I figured out the relationship between those two things, I need to go back to the second one. Blank are the monomers.
So it has to be the exact same relationship
of nucleic acid. So now I just have to think to myself, what was my memory clue?
So my memory clue for nucleic acids was N with N.
So what's the other term that we talked about that starts with the letter N?
It's nucleotide.
Yeah, it's our fancy steps. So amino acid is to protein as nucleotide is to nucleic acid. Now it's your job to figure out the relationship to answer number 2. Good luck.